Louisiana, 1865. The war was ending, but not for the plantations along the river. Here, freedom was a rumor carried on smoke. And here lived Jacob, 14 years old, thin as a reed, with eyes too old for his face. He was a boy in body, but the years had already stripped childhood from him, leaving behind only endurance. His master, William Harper, liked to show him off. Not as a son, not as a servant, but as a spectacle. Guests would gather on the veranda, sipping brandy and smearing grease across linen sleeves, while Jacob was summoned from the barn like a dog. "Sing, boy," Harper would command, and Jacob would sing, voice trembling with hymns that had once belonged to his mother. "Dance," Harper would laugh, and Jacob would shuffle barefoot in the dust until his soles bled. If he faltered, laughter rose sharper. Sometimes Harper ordered him to kneel in the dirt, still as stone, while visitors hurled mud, fruit peels, or scraps of bone at his head. It was called amusement. Jacob had learned to keep his face blank because smiles fed the cruelty and tears excited it. He looked past them, at the black horizon, at the swaying trees that never spoke, and dreamed of silence. One autumn afternoon, Harper dragged him to the parish fair. The air smelled of fried cornmeal and horse dung, of smoke from roasting pigs, and sweat from the bodies of men boasting their wealth. There was a wooden stage near the center of the grounds, a platform used for speeches and contests of strength. Harper's voice carried across the crowd, "Here's proof of a master's hand. Here's proof of Southern might." He shoved Jacob up the steps, stripped the shirt from his back with a single violent tug, and grinned wide at the gathering. "Watch now," Harper said, "see how a master proves his strength." Then he called for a whip. The crowd murmured, some amused, others eager. A tall overseer, hired for the fair, stepped forward with a leather lash coiled like a serpent in his hands. Jacob stood trembling, ribs like branches, skin stretched thin over bone. His heart thundered in his chest, but he said nothing. Silence had become his only shield. The first strike fell with the sound of tearing cloth. Pain burst across his shoulders, white and searing. The second drove him forward, knees buckling. By the 10th, the boy no longer breathed between blows. He only endured. Laughter rolled through the air like fire. Farmers, planters, women in silks, they all watched, eyes hungry. Some called for more, eager to see how much a boy could bear. 20 lashes. His skin burned and split, the world tilting. 30 lashes. His breath rattled, knees collapsing, vision dimming. He clung to the thought of his mother's voice, the way she used to hum in the quarters when he was very small. That sound became the only thing left of him. At last he fainted, collapsing like a rag doll onto the wooden stage. The crowd cheered as if victory had been won, though no battle had been fought. Harper raised his hands, smiling at the applause, then dragged the limp boy down from the platform like a trophy. Hours later, Jacob awoke on the dirt at the edge of the fairgrounds. His ribs screamed. His back was carved raw, his mouth filled with the copper taste of blood. Above him, the sky stretched wide and merciless. His master stood nearby, boots planted firm, expression unreadable. Harper bent low, his breath heavy with whiskey. "You're alive," he whispered, pressing a boot against the boy's ribs. "So you're still useful." The words sank deeper than the lash. Jacob stared at the ground, face expressionless, but something in him shifted. He did not yet know what, only that the words had entered him like a blade, carving a wound that would never close. That night, back in the barn where he was kept, Jacob lay on straw, the air stinking of manure and sweat. Each breath tore at his ribs, but the pain in his chest was worse than the pain in his skin. He thought of his mother, the day she had collapsed in the fields, her body refusing the weight of endless labor. Harper had stood over her then, too, telling Jacob, "Her life is worth less than my horse." Now he had told the boy the same thing, worthless, replaceable, a tool to be used until broken. But even in agony, Jacob refused to cry. He pressed his face into the straw and let the silence swallow him whole. Outside, the laughter of the fair still carried faintly on the wind, but inside the barn was only the sound of his own heartbeat, steady and defiant. The scar from that day would never leave him. It was burned into his skin, etched into his memory, stitched into the fabric of his being. He would carry it always, a brand not of ownership but of humiliation. The lash had been meant to break him, but it planted something else instead, a seed of fire, buried deep, waiting for the right moment to ignite. And so began the last chapter of Jacob's childhood. After the fair, life returned to its old rhythm, which was no rhythm at all, only the beat of commands and blows. Jacob no longer had a bed, if he ever could call the pallet in the corner of the kitchen one. He slept in the barn, among livestock whose hides were brushed more carefully than his own back. The air was thick with the musk of animals, the sour of manure, the biting sting of flies. At night the cows shifted and the horses stamped their hooves, but none of them judged him. They, at least, knew they were not free. His food came from scraps, cold and greasy, thrown to him when the kitchen mistress felt generous. Cornbread crusts, meat gristle, potato skins, slop scraped from the master's plates. Sometimes he ate what the pigs refused, crouched low so no one would see. Hunger hollowed him out, carved sharp edges into his cheeks, but his eyes stayed alert, restless, burning in the dark. Mistakes, real or imagined, brought punishment. A rod across the back for spilling water. A boot to the ribs for not bowing quickly enough. Harper liked to humiliate Jacob in front of others. He would summon him to the porch at dusk, hand him a pair of mud-smeared boots, and order him to polish them clean while overseers and guests looked on. The boy's hands worked fast, rubbing until the leather gleamed, but it was not enough. "Now show them how grateful you are," Harper would sneer, and Jacob, trembling, was forced to tip the bucket of blackened slop water over his own head. The liquid ran down his face, soaking his ragged shirt, leaving him shivering as the men roared with laughter. There was no corner of the plantation where he could escape his master's gaze. Harper had a gift for finding him. In the stable, in the smokehouse, in the yard. His voice was a chain that snapped and pulled Jacob wherever he wished. Sometimes, for sport, he made the boy kneel by the hounds, crawling on all fours, barking until his throat cracked. The guests would cheer, calling it the funniest sight they had seen all season. But it was at night, when the world fell quiet, that the true wounds opened. Jacob would lie on the straw, body aching from rods and fists, and the memories crept in. He remembered his mother collapsing in the fields, sweat soaking her dress, eyes rolling back as she sank to her knees. Harper had not lifted a hand to help. He had only looked at Jacob, still a small boy then, and said with a smile that cut like glass, "Your mother's life is worth less than my horse." Those words returned to him in the dark, sharper than any lash. They burrowed into his chest, twisting, festering. He had stopped crying by then, but the tears lived inside him, burning his throat. He whispered to himself, not prayers but fragments of memory. His mother's voice humming in the quarters, the sound of rain on the roof of their cabin before it was torn from them, the rhythm of her heartbeat when she held him close as a baby. Those memories were all he had left, and even they came with pain. The world around him was built on cruelty, disguised as order. The plantation fields stretched wide, heavy with cane and cotton, and the overseers rode through them like kings on horseback. From the veranda, Harper and his wife spoke of God's blessings and Southern honor, words that tasted like ash. They praised themselves for their wealth, for their hospitality, for their Christian charity. Yet in the quarters, children went barefoot in winter. Mothers wept for sons sold south, men bore scars that never healed. The hypocrisy was suffocating. On Sundays, Harper forced the enslaved to gather under the oak trees for prayers. He would read from his Bible, intoning words about obedience, about how servants must honor their masters. Jacob listened, head bowed, but inside he repeated the opposite. Every verse was a blade that cut deeper, every sermon a reminder that mercy was a language his master did not know. Sometimes Jacob wondered if the other slaves noticed him, the boy who seemed to attract his master's eye more than most. Some pitied him, whispering soft words when no overseer was near. Others avoided him, afraid that being too close would draw Harper's cruelty upon themselves. Isolation became his companion. Even in the quarters, he felt alone. The humiliation piled like stones on his back. One winter evening, Harper called Jacob to the front of the house as guests arrived for supper. He ordered the boy to kneel in the mud by the steps and wipe the visitors' shoes clean as they entered. "Let them see what kind of boy I've raised," Harper said proudly, as though Jacob's suffering were proof of his mastery. Each boot grew heavier, each scrape of mud darker, until Jacob's fingers bled. When at last the guests were seated inside, the boy remained outside in the cold, mud streaking his face. Harper appeared at the door, glass of brandy in hand. He looked down at Jacob, who was shivering in the night air, and smiled. "A fine servant," he declared, loud enough for the room to hear. "Obedient as a dog." Jacob lowered his head, but inside something shifted again. The words stung less than before. They no longer carved him down, they began to carve something else, something harder, sharper, like flint. The days blended, each one a repetition of labor and pain. Yet inside the boy, the silence grew denser, thicker. He spoke less, laughed never, and cried not at all. His eyes, once quick with fear, grew steady, fixed on the ground, but seeing more than he let on. In the darkness of the barn, he rehearsed not escape. He had no illusions about running, but survival. And perhaps something beyond survival, though the thought was not yet clear. Jacob was 14. He had known nothing but chains, commands, and cruelty. But a seed had been planted in him that even Harper's lash could not uproot. It was waiting, silent, patient, deep in the marrow of his bones. Spring 1865 came lean and wet, a season of mud that swallowed hoofprints and secrets. Rumors of armies moving like storms drifted along the river, but on Harper's land the only news that mattered was the master's mood. He threw a feast to prove plenty, while the world frayed candles blazing, hog fat gleaming, fiddle scraping a reckless tune. Jacob worked the edges of it like a shadow, ferrying platters, catching bones in his hands so they wouldn't clatter on the floor. He moved without a sound. The lash had trained him to float. When the guests were drunk enough to mistake cruelty for wit, William Harper rose grinning, brandy glass trembling in his fist. "You'll want to see quick," he crowed. "My boy here works like a miracle." He caught Jacob by the collar, dragged him from the warm stink of the dining room into the night air where frogs sang in the ditches. Down the yard, past the hounds, past the smokehouse, into the barn where lantern light shook in nervous halos. The animals stirred, the hay smelled of old rain and iron. "Show 'em," Harper said, though no one had followed. He didn't need an audience anymore. Humiliation had become a private devotion. He kicked a stool across the floor. "Faster," he barked, and faster again, and when speed turned to blur, he laughed. He knocked Jacob sideways, knuckles bright with rings. The boy struck a post and tasted pennies. His tooth loosened, and then with the next blow surrendered. It clinked against the dirt like a dropped bead. "Crawl," Harper ordered, "on all fours. Bark for me." Jacob's knees burned through cloth, splinters found the tender places in his palms. He circled the lantern like a dog tied to an invisible stake. The master's boots followed, lazy, amused. "You hear that?" Harper murmured to no one, to himself, to God. "That's order." He pressed the boy's face into straw until the world turned muffled and brown. When Jacob gasped, the man laughed and pressed harder. "Quick," I said, "quick." Something hollowed out then and made room for a colder thing. Jacob stopped imagining the river, stopped hearing the fiddle, stopped remembering the hymns. He quit the useless trick of hoping the night would blink and become day. He stood on his knees, not from command, but from refusal. The lantern shook, throwing ragged light across a wall where old harnesses hung like slumbering snakes. Harper's voice became a smear words without edges, just heat and liquor and breath. The barn listened. The animals did too. The boy's heartbeat slowed until it matched the creak of the rafters. He saw, clear as a blade laid on cloth, the shape of an ending. Not escape, not running, not miles of swamp with dogs behind. An ending that stayed, an ending that looked back. Harper slapped him again, open-palmed, almost lazy, and said the line he loved. "Alive means useful." The sentence rang once and went still. Jacob felt for the place inside that used to break. It wasn't there. Only a clean room remained, white and sharp as winter. Around them, tools waited in their places. A rusted scythe, a bent pitchfork, a length of rope coiled on a peg where the heady sweetness of tar still clung. Jacob reached without looking like a boy fetching twine for chores and felt the rope's coarse truth under his fingers. He did not blink. He did not tremble. He tested the weight the way his mother once tested melons at market, thumb to rind, ear to heart. The rope spoke back. Enough. Think you're better'n me? Harper slurred, stepping close as if daring the air to answer. Spit flecked Jacob's cheek. The boy's jaw clicked where the tooth had been, and the small pain, bright and neat, told him he was awake. Harper shoved him backward into the stall. Wood answered with a hollow thud. Above, the center beam ran dark and heavy, worn smooth by years of hanging tack and winter meat. In that instant, time thinned like old fabric. Jacob could thread it. He saw the path through, how a knot becomes a sentence, how a beam becomes a judgment post, how a man's breath can be persuaded to stop. Not rage was messy, loud, a fire that told on itself. This would be colder. This would be what the whip had taught, precision. Harper turned to reach for a strap, to fashion a fresh game. The lantern hummed. The horses stamped, uneasy, as if some agreement older than law had been made in their presence. Jacob stood, not fast, not slow, with the rope in his hand like any barn chore. He measured length with 3 pulls, the way he'd watched men measure reins. He pictured the knot he'd seen sailors tie on the river, the one snagged forever in his memory because it looked like a clenched fist. Crawl, the master said again. Bored now, as if routine could rescue him. Jacob did not kneel. He stepped in, close enough to smell the sweet rot of brandy hiding under Harper's breath, close enough to hear the thud behind the man's ribs. He felt nothing that needed to be named. The rope uncoiled like a thought he'd been having for years and only now remembered in full. Outside, the frogs sang louder. Somewhere distant, a cannon's ghost rolled across the sky, a last echo of a country tearing. In here, the world narrowed to 2 bodies and a beam. Jacob's hands moved with a calm he did not recognize as his own. He was not big, not strong, not swift. He was steady. Every humiliation he'd swallowed became a simple motion, over, under, through. A loop, a noose, a hush. When the knot lay finished against his palm, small and final, he looked at it the way a man might look at a ring, something that binds and declares. His face did not change, his breath did not quicken. The boy who had danced in dust and sang for laughter was gone. Only the listener remained, the one who had learned how to wait inside pain until it told him its use. Harper, sensing nothing, turned again, muttering about dogs and boys and order. Jacob lifted the rope, eyes on the beam, and the barn seemed to bow. The ending had chosen its shape. The choice had chosen him back. And the night, which once had been a prison, opened like a door. Dawn came thin and pewter, the kind of light that hides its face. Fog lay low over the cane, like breath held too long, and the rooster mistook the hush for permission. Jacob rose before the sound, before the hounds stirred, before any clock could name the hour. He moved as he always had. Small, quick, forgettable only, the stillness inside him had changed. It had turned from a bruise into a blade. The big house slept off its drink. Windows were grey with the night's last stain. The parlour reeked of tallow and pride gone sour. On the veranda, a glass lay overturned in a ring of its own shadow. Jacob crossed the yard with the step of a boy sent for kindling, shoulders rounded, hands empty to any watcher who might have been watching. No one was. He slipped through the kitchen door where embers glowed like quiet eyes. He took nothing metal, nothing loud, only a small room key he had palmed a dozen times before and returned without notice. It rode his thumb like a memory. Boards sighed under him and then thought better of it. He passed the dining room, where the chairs still stood to attention around the wreck of last night crumbs, a fallen napkin, a knife abandoned mid-argument. The house breathed shallow, drunk on itself. Harper's room faced east, greedy for the first light. Jacob knew the door, the squeak at the bottom hinge, the map of the floor between rug and bed where no board complained. He had mended that rug once under the mistress's orders, pushing the needle through with a child's bite of tongue, learning how cloth could hide a wound. He used that knowledge now. He was no taller than the chest at the foot of the bed. He was no older than his scars. But his shadow walked ahead of him and did not shake. The key turned soft in the lock. He entered with the dawn. William Harper lay spread like a boast, one arm flung over the pillow, the other hand at his belly as if to keep its secrets. The room smelled of sweat, cloves, and stale victory. Boots waited by the hearth, polished by hands that had learned to love what they hated so no one would see the hate. A whip coil slept on a chair, neat, obedient. Jacob stood a moment and listened to the breathing. He had learned men by the shape their breath made. Harper's was a saw through damp wood. There was a time when that sound had meant danger, orders, humiliation to come. Now it was only time running. He did not speak. Words had always fed the master. He let silence have its work. The boy's hands moved with barn knowledge. Measure, loop, pull. No flourish. He slid the rope from his waist, where he had hidden it beneath his shirt, skin already burned from its roughness. He made the knot again in the dim, over, under, through, until it lay in his palm like a new law. He'd rehearsed this shape by touch until it was not a plan, but a fact waiting to arrive. Harper stirred, lips smacking, face folding toward a dream of command. Jacob stepped closer and cuffed the sound from his mouth with the air itself. One hand, quick and hard, not to hurt, only to remind the body it had other business. The man sighed and drifted. Jacob moved to the bedpost. The rope climbed the wood as if it remembered trees. He set the loop with a care he had once wasted on polishing boots. Outside, a bird tested morning. The sound bled under the curtains and lay at Jacob's feet. He ignored it. His heartbeat was slow, the way it had been in the barn when he saw the beam for what it was. He had been made to kneel like a dog. Now he stepped where masters stepped, not to inherit, but to end. The first touch woke Harper, not the rope, the absence. Jacob's face above him, where none should be. The man's eyes pulled into focus and found something they did not recognize. He opened his mouth to summon the house, the yard, the world. Jacob's hand fell over his lips, the way a mother hushes a child in church. The other hand, calm, sure, delivered the loop. It was not a struggle. Rage thrashes, justice arranges. Harper's body remembered power and tried to reach it. Jacob's small weight turned that reaching into pointing to the ceiling beam, to the limit of breath, to the barn waiting. The bed groaned. A bottle toppled and did not break. Jacob tightened what needed tightening, not crude, not kind. The man's eyes went large with the discovery that the world could go on without him. When it was done enough to hold, the boy stood back and watched the chest heave, not in pity, not in thrill, only to know the measure of minutes. He set a folded sheet between skin and rope to spare the wood from stain. It was the sort of detail he'd learned from serving how to present ruin as order. The man's hands clawed at nothing, then at truth, and found no purchase. Jacob waited until the struggle dimmed to a tremor. Dawn moved a finger along the plaster. He did not hide him. He hauled what he had made from the room across floor, down hall, past portraits that pretended to be ancestors instead of crimes. Jacob was small, but vengeance has a tendon all its own. The body bumped each stair like an old lie, coming down into daylight. He opened the back door with his foot, let the yard's cold enter and pinch his lungs awake. Mist wrapped their legs. The hounds, smelling everything, decided this was beyond them and lay down. The barn received them without surprise. It had seen rope in more innocent shapes. Jacob pitched the ladder forward with care, as if reaching fruit. He worked alone and on time. The loop took the beam as if it had been waiting. The slack obeyed. Gravity signed. He left the boots on. He left the shirt twisted. He left the mouth open the way it had been when it named him dog, mule, entertainment, property. He did not close the eyes, let them face the stalls and the harness and the buckets and the patient backs that had borne this man's days. Let them learn, for as long as learning remained, what work looked like when it answered back. He did not call the yard. He returned the ladder to the wall and leaned it neat, same as always. He brushed straw from his knees. He straightened the rope coil he had borrowed from its peg and cut the end square with a pocket blade so no one would curse the fray. He opened the big doors wide, threw both to the hinges, and let the morning in like a witness. Then he went outside and washed his hands in the trough. Water bit his knuckles. He scrubbed until the rope's ghost let go. His tooth socket throbbed with each heartbeat, a drum keeping count for history. He spat pink into the mud and watched it fade. Some endings demand a message. Jacob did not write one. He arranged one. He carried the master's chair from the porch into the barn's mouth and set it under nothing. On the chair, he placed the whip, coiled small and tidy, the handle pointing outward like a courtesy. He took the polished boots Harper favored on Sundays and set them side by side just inside the threshold, toes aimed at the fields that would not come to his rescue. Finally, on a nail by the door, he hung the key to the room where orders had been born, the key that had believed it ruled. It swung gently and made a sound like a thin bell. He stepped back. The composition was plain: beam, rope, body, chair, lash, light. No flourish, no sermon, a boy's answer to a man's life. From the quarters the first voices rose, women rousing fire, men coughing the night from their throats, a child stumbling out of a dream. The day was arriving on schedule. Jacob stood aside and let it. He did not run. He had nowhere to go that wasn't here. He had chosen the place where humiliation had been performed to perform its opposite. He had chosen visibility over survival, truth over breath. When the first field hand came for the mule, he stopped in the doorway and did not call out. His face changed, not into fear, not into joy, but into something that had been waiting behind his eyes for years. Another came, and another. No screaming, only the sound of boots stepping back onto earth that suddenly felt level. No one looked at Jacob first. They looked at the beam. They looked at the shape of the morning. They looked at the chair with its quiet coil. Then they looked at the boy who had been told nightly he was less than an animal, and they did not see a child. They saw a hinge turning. Behind them, the big house stirred, curtains twitching, a servant sent, a door thrown open by hands that had never imagined doors could be thrown at them. Soon there would be noise, galloping, shouting, papers, prayers. Soon the world would try to rename what had happened. But for one full minute, the plantation belonged to stillness. It had the weight of a verdict. The fog lifted its hem. Birds started again, tentative, as if surprised by their own permission. Jacob breathed as if he had not, truly, in years. He did not speak when they asked him. He did not point, explain, boast, beg. He stood in the mouth of the barn with the day behind him and let the rope say what language had failed to carry. That a boy, counted as nothing, had taken the measure of a man counted as everything and found him smaller than breath. This was not a sudden rage. This was a long decision, arriving exactly on time. Sunrise found the barn open like a mouth that had finished speaking. No one screamed. A hush moved through the yard, clean and heavy, the kind that follows a storm that never raised its voice. Men stood with hats in their hands. Women folded their arms across old wounds as if to keep them from answering. Children stared the longest, learning a lesson no catechism had offered. A body can hang where a name once sat on a throne. The big house tried to wake the world, the old way bells, orders, threats, but sound slid off the morning. The overseer approached with a pistol, took one look, and forgot his lines. A stable boy reached for Jacob's shoulder, then let his hand fall. The boy did not run. He stood where he had stood at dawn, in the threshold of the barn, the light making a small crown of dust around his head. By noon the sheriff arrived, all starch and oath. He measured rope, beam, angle, as if the barn were a courtroom and wood kept minutes. He asked questions Jacob did not answer. "Savage murder," he pronounced to the ledger, then, squinting at the thin child before him, added, "insanity," so the page would forgive the imbalance. The coroner, eager to be helpful, wrote misadventure by strangulation, as though gravity had acted alone. Rumour galloped faster than any horse. By evening the parish road bore riders headed for town, each carrying a version. In one telling, devils had lifted the master by the ankles. In another, the boy had slipped his skin and turned into wind. By the time the newspaper men set type, they had their headline, "Boy Clal's Master, hangs him like a thief." They placed the word boy large so readers could marvel at the joke. They printed madness so they could sleep. But in the quarters, language walked differently. No one said madness, they said memory, they said measure. Old Hannah, who had buried 3 children and 2 names, looked toward the barn and nodded once, the way a midwife nods when a hard birth chooses the child. Isaiah the field hand, shoulders like gates, whispered, he answered. A girl traced a loop in the dirt with her toe and whispered Jacob's name as if it were new rope woven from air. That day changed the light. Men stepped into the rows with backs that did not bow the same way. Women folded bread and thought of future mouths that might learn truth in full sentences. Even the dogs, who understood rank better than scripture, kept to the shade as if modesty had become law. The widow in the big house ordered the body cut down. No one moved. A foreman said the rope was evidence and must remain. No one laughed. The sheriff finally gestured to Jacob. Take him, he said, meaning custody. But the boy simply turned and reached for a pail, dipped water, washed his hands again, and set the pail down where the master's boots once waited. The sheriff looked around and discovered, to his irritation, that he had not been granted an audience. Toward dusk, they did cut Harper down, because flies do not honor revolutions, and laid him on a door used as a bier. Someone fetched a sheet. Someone did not fetch a minister. The ground accepted the weight the way earth does, without comment. A few lines were spoken for the sake of custom. None were remembered. The paper printed the next morning with a second headline, Calm restored on Harper Place. It was a lie the size of a county. Calm had never lived there, and what arrived that day was not its cousin. What arrived was a knowledge that refused to be unlearned. That a boy could take back a gaze, and that shame, when lifted to a beam, becomes instruction. Weeks later, soldiers in tired blue rode the road and said the war was done. That letters in Washington had set words loose that could not be chased back into pens. Men on neighboring places whispered of freedom as if it were a hawk beautiful, distant, and likely to carry off a hen. On Harper's land, the word sat different. It had already had a face. Children played a new game near the well. One would stand on a stool and raise a braided vine. The others would point, not laughing, not crying, just practicing the posture of witnesses. Mothers let them, then taught them another game. A march to the fence and back with empty hands raised, because even justice can be mistaken at a distance for threat. Preachers came and called it sin, then, seeing the eyes that met theirs, changed the sermon to providence. Abolition men visited from town and wrote in their little books, fixing Jacob to ink so Northerners might read courage without smelling the barn. They asked the boy for a statement. He shook his head. Silence had done the heavy lifting. It would finish the job. Years later, because years insisted on happening, the rope's shadow remained on the beam like a bruise that weather could not wash. New owners failed, then left. The house sagged. Cane grew where orders used to. In certain seasons, crows gathered on the ridgepole as if attending class. They turned their heads to the side and watched the door. Nobody carved Jacob's story on stone. It traveled where stone could not, along tongues at dusk, in stitchwork tucked into quilts, in the ways men learned to stand before speaking. Newspapers kept the word savage in their archives. The quarters kept a different one, the one that fits inside a mouth without burning. Reckoning. And when people asked, in towns far away, what happened the morning William Harper was found like that, those who knew answered plain. A boy corrected the record.